Between January 20th and March 31st, and counting digital sales, Nintendo's recent report on their fiscal year earnings shows that Fire Emblem Engage has sold around 1.61 million units, where 430,000 of those came straight from Japan. Pretty good numbers given the game's been out for 10 weeks by that point, right? Well, yes, in a vacuum they are good. The catch is, though, that the game is still trailing hard behind Three Houses. As a bit of context, the first solid data we got about Three Houses' sales came from a document containing Nintendo's financial highlights up until September 30th of 2019. Given that the game released back in July 26th, this meant that they had 1 week less, 9 compared to Engage's 10, to gather data. And despite being a little bit behind, the game had sold by then 2.29 million units, with 480,000 coming from Japan. The fact that its Japanese sales are closer to Three Houses by a similar time frame also matches up with the fact that Engage's pre-orders in COMG more than doubled its predecessor, and counting digital sales, which sadly aren't available for us. This meant the game was set to, and most likely did, have a far bigger launch, counting both physical and digital. And I say most likely because shortly after launch, Engage's sales took a big nosedive and have long since vanished from the charts, both in Japan and North America. Meaning Engage had a very front-loaded launch and has long since stopped selling enough copies worth charting. An aspect worth considering is also that the context both games ended up releasing on couldn't have been more different. Three Houses was first announced in a Fire Emblem Direct back in 2017, was officially revealed on E3 2018, got a new huge trailer in E3 2019, and released just 1 month later in July in what was the Switch's third year, a time where there weren't many huge releases it would be directly competing with. Pokemon Sword and Shield, for example, launched 5 months after Three Houses, and got post-launch support which lasted 7 months up until February 2020. Not to mention it was also pre-COVID pandemic, meaning people were in a better situation financially to afford the game, and it would later get some free marketing through Byleth's inclusion in Smash in 2020 to boot. By comparison, Fire Emblem Engage was officially revealed post-pandemic in September 2022, got 4 main trailers between November and January of the next year, launched shortly in January of 2023 in the Switch's 7th year. Just 3 months after Nintendo's other big main release, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet got 3 months of post-launch additions and faced some competition from other key launches like Advance Wars Reboot Camp, February's Kirby's Return to Dreamland DX, and had Tears of the Kingdom looming. It was more difficult to justify spending $70 on this game when there was more to choose from and look forward to. Not to mention Smash's DLC is long over, and it wouldn't be getting any free advertising from it compared to its predecessor. So all in all, it would be hard to claim Engage and Three Houses got even near the same amount of spotlight given how different the gaming landscape looked for each case. But what I think is the biggest takeaway from the market context was that whatever momentum Three Houses had over Engage by release time was just that. Regardless if Three Houses was more hyped up, Engage still had a stronger initial launch. Were it treated the same, then I suppose the most we could say would be that Engage could have had a far bigger launch, but that's not really the point I want to focus on. It's the aftermath of release. Even though I talk about the staying power of Engage, I think it would be right to acknowledge that first and foremost, that Three Houses was just in a better place in the market through more certain economic times, less competition after launch, more outside support and cameos with Smash, and a more stretched out DLC path. Engage started extremely hot, hotter than Three Houses, but sales basically peaked early and have been in a cooldown ever since. Meanwhile, Three Houses was more sustained, and if I had to make an educated guess, I would say it was positively affected by replayability and word of mouth. This video, as a result, will discuss the effects of replayability and word of mouth and how both games are affected by it, while also speaking about my personal experience with Engage both as a content creator and enthusiast of Fire Emblem. I've gotten really into sales history for the series as of late, mainly because some current videos in the pipeline, like my last one about FE3's commercial dominance, have had parts focusing on sales and how they got there. This next part is based on my experience talking about both Three Houses and Engage, and if you're not relatively new to Fire Emblem and or Engage isn't your first FE game, then this probably won't come off as a shocker. 3H and Engage are both really interesting case studies of the power of replayability and word of mouth. The first question I ask myself is honestly, is it right to consider Engage Engage a commercial failure relative to the other games' success. It broke past 1 million in sales globally and is the 4th best-selling Fire Emblem game currently. I comment on this because we don't know if this was what Engage had shot for as far as Intelligent Systems and Nintendo are concerned, but I can't imagine the massive cliff fall that had its next couple months be a desired outcome. It's also here where I should mention that at the end of the day, Engage to me feels like it was treated like a game in an extremely competitive and fluid industry, where a new title is hot and popular until its time passes so publishers can focus on the next game. I can understand people feeling disconnected with all these Three Houses connections when in truth, Three Houses feels like its relevance for years was an outlier more than anything. That being said, Intelligent Systems made choices for Engage that I believe contributed to this drop-off that were controllable, unlike things like release delays, the pandemic, and competition. And that's what I want to focus on for this video. Engage was an anniversary title that has its moments of self-indulgence, is deliberately smaller in scale and scope than what came before, and often reminds us how far this series has come since 1990. So I'm not gonna lie. Scrutinizing this game has felt challenging at times because often I've wondered if I've set my expectations too high on a game that never seemed intended to be closely compared to Three Houses or any other previous title. But I don't think pulling punches really benefits this or any other IP at all, as long as you're reasonable with what you have to say. Just because this game set out for a more casual story and character premise that leans closer to Fire Emblem Warriors than previous titles doesn't exempt it from how that premise was executed. A simple story doesn't mean it can only be delivered simply or unseriously. And at the same token, an ambitious premise can sometimes flop in execution completely. And for gameplay, it is clear IS tried extremely hard and succeeded in delivering an exceptional experience in this regard. So why not just be honest about its faults as well? I mean, I paid like 90 bucks Canadian for this game plus the DLC, so I will be pretty negative in this video, but it's because I want the best for the series. I know I'm not the first person to say this. In fact, a lot of my peers thought the exact same thing. But this was what I said at the end of my first Engage playthrough. I feel like a lot of Fire Emblem players are new and they might have only played Three Houses before, and there's an ass ton of like notoriety behind that game. I don't know if that's gonna be like good for the longevity and like the memorability of this game, I guess. I don't think this game is gonna have that much staying power in terms of like Fire Emblem games. I will get back to this clip, but for context, it was mostly in reference to Engage's story and characters really not being able to leave a strong, lasting impression on players. I will elaborate more on this and how it more closely relates to the power of word of mouth, but first I want to go over replay value, because Engage is a game after all. By the way Engage was designed, having less replay value compared to its predecessors was going to be an L Intelligent Systems was destined to take on this one. Unlike Blazing Sword, Sacred Stones, Fates, and Three Houses, this is a one-route game. Unlike Genealogy of the Holy War and Awakening, this is a one-route game without a second generation of units. Replayability plays a huge role in the lifespan of a game, not to point out the obvious, but one of Fire Emblem's strongest characteristics as a series is how unique your own playthrough can be to anyone else's, how each run you make can be taken in a different way, how a unit death can greatly change the story of your run, how creative you can be by challenging yourself in your next run by restricting units under some fun rule. Fire Emblem by its inception was meant to be replayable. It's, not even joking, one of its founding principles. Fire Emblem and replayability have taken some interesting directions. More recently, it has adopted the multiple routes aspect, encouraging you to replay them to see new characters, chapters, and perspectives. This greatly carried Three Houses' relevancy because not only did it let you start the game in any route you wanted, it would influence your perspective on the second playthrough. You'd want to play the third one to round it out, and there was also a fourth route that people got surprised by, I guess. Even if the Academy arc was the same, each class brought different character interactions and viewpoints to the same events going on. It was never done in the series before to this scale, and kept even the early game fresh. Three Houses' biased storytelling also spurred a lot of heated character and story discussion, but it ultimately fell into word of mouth and assisted in sustaining the game for years. But what about games that may not have had as much heated debates on characters and story? What about games with less divisiveness in its multiple routes? What about single story games like Awakening and the Telly's duology? These games are easy to replay. I understand that whoever is watching this right now has their own tolerance to hub worlds in Fire Emblem, but no matter how you cut it, hub areas seem to be the mainstay of the series moving forward. And while the first playthrough is tolerable and fun and novel, it's undeniable that having to go back and commit any amount of time to not actually playing the chapter maps themselves will be less and less tolerable as time goes on. Hub area activities just get redundant by design, and the novelty of them have diminishing returns. Hub areas can absolutely exist, and there's no better example than in Radiant Dawn's base camps and Fates' My Castle. RD set the groundwork for bases and gave you everything you needed for unit progression and provided characterization through base conversations. My Castle took this and Awakening's Barracks 2 and gave us the best user experience you could really ever need. It provided unique base customization. You could streamline unit and character progression in whatever way you wanted. You could place your armory, shop, and forge next to each other, could easily sift through inventories and menus, and everything else was largely optional. Supports were already really easy to grind in this game, and all the essentials weren't just in arm's reach, but load times weren't a factor at all. Everything was readily available by excellent use of the 3DS's screens. You could zip around, enter and exit shops, go to the mess hall, prison, and be on your way. This is all to say that these hub areas respected your time completely. This meant the shortest amount of time between maps. The way hub areas are structured right now, with 3 houses and Engage, and even 3 Hopes, which was an improvement to houses, is by design never going to reach that same level of convenience. These areas are huge, and while they have fast travel, you still need to sift through menus and load times. Until Fire Emblem lets us have that same bird's eye perspective in hub areas like Fates did, they will never be as fast. All hub areas, even Fates, had casual time waster activities that, yes, were optional, but in Engage, even the necessary activities were needlessly, annoyingly long. Need to grind the arena? You have to listen to the same arena intros over and over and over again. Want early game stat boosts like strength and skill? Do time-consuming workout activities until you lose your patience and just spend gold on tonics, or go eat. Thankfully, the game made UX improvements like bringing skill inheritance directly to the arena area instead of the ring chamber. But for another example, want to experiment with endgame builds? Eventually you're going to have to grind very painfully slow fishing just for more bond fragments. 3 Houses also had New Game Plus, a game mode so fun and smart for the multi-route game that it was that I made a video explaining just how much more fun the game becomes with it. Even though Engage was a one-route experience, it absolutely does not mean it didn't need New Game Plus. Broken endgame builds with the highest level of SP costs take an extremely long time to grind, and when playing on maddening, SP and bond fragment grinding is even more difficult as you don't have skirmishes to grind on. A New Game Plus would have been greatly beneficial just to even go through the game one more time with already invested units to re-experience the game with so much more power in build, skills, support, and bond levels. Bond fragments and SP could be carried over. 3 Houses made the most out of this because it essentially fast-tracked you to new content while letting you play around with units and giving you the chance to green text your stats. The fact that Engage has nothing like this really sucks and makes replaying the game less enticing. Engage is, like I said, a single route experience without a second generation to help bolster replayability. This inherently isn't bad. In fact, for the most part in Fire Emblem, this is usually how it was. I don't have any expectations that the next game will have multiple routes, but you can see how much of an impact this makes for replayability. But on a micro level, 3 Houses and Fates benefited from things like new paralogs and new character interactions that came from those paralogs, new unit progression ideas, all these things that greatly bolster a game's staying power. 3 Houses' other routes let you start with an entirely new set of characters, each with their own unique set of attributes and interactions with other characters. I strongly believe this was a great boon to the game's replay value. This was unprecedented for the series to be done at this scale, and unlike Fates, this didn't require separate games to experience. Mileage will vary with people's experience going through the Academy arc again, and people's enjoyment on the class system will also vary, but ultimately, these gave players reasons to go back. Don't get me wrong, I feel very similarly about the monastery activities like the Somniel activities. In fact, in my opinion, the Somniel is just an improvement, but I will touch on that later. The weakest part of Three Houses' replayability was having to go back to the monastery every route. Garrick Mach absolutely does not get a pass for this despite the topic being about Engage. This section on replayability will be making a lot of comparisons to Three Houses and Fates. And for the record, my argument against the Somniel would be the same with the monastery, but to me that just makes hub areas being that much more of a glaring issue that it's happened twice in a row. 3 if you count Three Hopes. It's effective replayability versus perceived replayability. Perceived replayability are replay features in concept, things like a diverse class system, multiple routes, a second generation of units, branching story paths and endings, the hot marketing stuff. Whereas effective replayability is how those concepts actually play out in reality. Revisiting the monastery over and over again got tiresome because the game forces you to re-experience the same lengthy content 3 to 4 times to get the full experience. The novelty of the class system dwindles as, yes, a unit can be reclassed to virtually anything else, but its endgame builds strips a lot of individuality to them, and in my experience, a lot of builds end up being the same anyway. Perception promises 3 to 4 routes with unique stories, and while that's true, the game recycles a ton of maps. This is where New Game Plus really helps bolster effective replayability, but mileage and tolerance for repeating a lot of Three Houses' content is going to vary, and Three Houses burnout was a real thing. But the thing is, in the case with these two games, quality effective replayability matters far less than the quantity of perceived replayability in regards to the staying power of a game. The fact that it's there to begin with is what matters. You can hate replaying Three Houses, but the fact is, you're replaying Three Houses. This contributes to its lifespan, word of mouth, fear of missing out, and most importantly, sales. Engage is still replayable because you can build units in different ways the second time around. You can play on a harder difficulty, you can do draft runs, or you can do challenge runs, but that is standard replayability for the series and nothing unique to Engage. But the minutia, the in-between chapter grind of these Switch games, tanks replay value, and Engage doesn't have the multiple routes or New Game Plus to fall back on to get the player base to buy in my opinion. One may think, just ignore the Somniel. The thing is, you can't ignore the Somniel's core activities without making the gameplay experience objectively harder. I don't want to go on a no Somniel challenge run of Engage. It doesn't feel good to simply leave resources on the table in a game that is constantly conditioning you to make the most of them. But I don't want to waste my time with boring minigames or dialogue I can't skip. Sometimes I want to challenge myself in the next playthrough, but sometimes I don't want my playthrough experience to be harder. I just want to play Fire Emblem, but I need to spend time in the Somniel. I need to forge my weapons in the Somniel. I need to sit through the same lines for entire campaigns in the Somniel. I need to do chores in the Somniel. I have honestly grown so wary of these hub areas, personally. Characters in the Somniel don't even have interesting things to say about the world going on. At least with the monastery, finding the characters was worthwhile to see what their thoughts were on what just happened last chapter, because the writing tried to invest you in what was going on. But Engage's cast and world is so disconnected from the already boring story that I've never once gone out of my way to listen to a character's input on what just happened. The complicated thing is, as Fire Emblem introduces unique, gameplay-defining mechanics, these hub areas need to expand on those ideas. So much of Three Houses' instructing gameplay loop had to do with monastery activities that cost professor points, and it was on the player to manage it. Meal hall, gardening, choir, tea time, arena, the sauna, etc. Three Houses had battalions, so a battalion guild was required. This system wasn't perfect by any means. Fishing, for example, operated outside this economy and was exploitable for grinding professor rank. Engage had the rings, and core Somniel activities had to do with them, arena, ring chamber activities, and skill inheritance, but none of those core activities needed a hub world for those things to exist, nor do I think they actively benefited from it. But to give Engage actual credit, the Somniel is a noteworthy gameplay improvement from the monastery. The streamlining and time efficiency of getting key tasks done is better. There's a lot less to manage, and there's no limited resource gauges to think about. The fact that the Somniel can become a repeatable process of arena, inheritance, meal hall, farmhouse, and plaza, or less tasks depending on the player's routine, is just an improvement over Three Houses' load times, multiple tasks to get items, skills, and motivation points, and its various shops, and its redundant fetch quests, and so on. It is inevitable that a new Fire Emblem game not based on remakes is going to introduce a core mechanic that will be expanded on in its hub area, but my biggest hope is that they return to form with something as convenient, customizable, social, and simple as my castle. And I say this with my whole chest, I want them to give me a bird's eye view perspective option. Or if that can't happen, at least let me skip virtually everything I would ever want. Or let me just build the hub area myself, give players the option to interact with the tools in the hub menu via a system without these areas being blocked behind loading screens. Fates happened in like 2014 or something, and it's so good. And that's it for replayability, but there's another part that I want to cover. The story and characters. The second reason I think Engage fell out of relevancy quickly was because it was, uncharacteristically for the series, completely forgettable. Discussing the story is a bit tricky because I'm definitely not about to argue that the explicit reason for the game's fall-off was because the story was bad, but conversely, I do believe that Three Houses' success had to do with its narrative design, story, and character writing. Engage didn't write itself to the point of killing itself off, but it isn't an effective part of the sales pitch in my opinion. Also, just as a heads up, I am going to be critical of the story here and there, and if you happen to really enjoy the story, then I'll be honest, this part of the video might not resonate with you, and that's okay. It's evident I'm not a fan of the game's writing, but if you happen to be, then I'm happy that you got enjoyment out of it. Back to the clip I mentioned earlier. The reason I said this was because, as I was playing through Engage and experiencing the story, I kept coming back to the opinion that Engage's story is unremarkable, boring, and makes weird, unnecessary risks that make it worse. A lot of people only play Fire Emblem like once or twice, and in my experience, when people talk about old games, they often don't talk about any specific map over and over again. For example, when people talk about FE4, are they referring to Chapter 5's gameplay, or what happens to the characters in Chapter 5? Whenever FE7 or FE8 are brought up, it's basically always about something that happened with the characters or the story. Back to Engage's case, will you find people having discussions about the Fel Xenologue's story and characters? Yes. Will you find character essays on people like Yunaka, Ivy, or Alchrist? Absolutely. It's not like there's absolutely zero things redeemable about the writing. In fact, I've made a couple videos on the supports in this game, and I'm a decent fan of story-relevant characters like Hortensia and Vale. But on a macro level, it's undeniable that Engage does not have anything close to the character discourse of previous games. Developer interviews mentioned they wanted a character-driven story with Elyos as the main focus, but at the same time, they wanted the story to serve mostly as a means to get you from one map to the next. It certainly came off that way in practice, but that combination does not make for a strong, memorable impression being a high priority. This, plus the lack of anything interesting or new, the lack of relevance to non-royal characters, there's literally only 2 character paralogs and it's Anna and John in the early game, and extremely light world building and lore for the most bland and uncreative Fire Emblem world in the series, and what you have is a very unimpressive and forgettable experience. I'd say the story is at its best when it explores the concept of family and what that means for characters like Elyos, Hortensia, Vale, and the Hounds, but unfortunately, that doesn't come close to the majority of the tale. It's not even notoriously divisive enough like Fates' ideas to talk about. Fates had a lot of plot devices which are not inherently bad, and ideas to drive the story forward, which you could talk about, but Engage feels so inoffensive by design, you can't even do that. Fates was a risky and ambitious story that, in my opinion, fell flat, but that stuck in people's minds. This is all to say that when it comes to the story, I found that I, someone who talks about Fire Emblem stories and characters for a majority of my time on this platform, have a really hard time recommending it or even just praising it. Word of mouth and fear of missing out plays a big role in sustainability for Fire Emblem games, and it's clear that Three Houses naturally stayed relevant in people's minds because of how big the game was and how invested people got into the story and characters. But when you remove that as part of Engage's lifespan or experience, of course it's going to fall by the wayside. So many people saw Three Houses for the first time or heard about it first from others either passively or literally as a recommendation to play. A lot of folks who never typically play RPGs, let alone something as niche as an SRPG, got into this game. Three Houses got the Smash treatment, which definitely helped popularize and sustain the game even longer, but unit performance lists or tier lists will only be appealing to fans who are hardcore enough to care. Those discussions will not leave the niche, and nobody outside of those communities will understand if a unit being better than another is controversial. You don't even need to have played a Fire Emblem game to experience any story. You can watch someone else play silently, and you are instantly able to contribute to the conversation. The thing is, Engage was designed around the idea that this could be the first Fire Emblem game for a lot of people, and the premise that the story will be simple to understand for a younger audience to cling onto is fine, I guess. But My question is how much simplicity is too much? There's so many instances where I, as a player, was left wondering if I'm even supposed to take the plot seriously at all. Am I supposed to be invested or aren't I? Some argue that the story is actually a parody, that it is a form of self-referential meta-camp, but even though I disagree, the fact that it's even part of the conversation speaks volumes of Engage's presentation of story and characters. Just because the story aims to sit on its laurels and has moments of self-indulgence and celebration and makes dozens and dozens of nods to its history, that doesn't mean it can't try to take itself more seriously or put some effort in. Because there's instances where it does. It is clear that the writers can write compelling moments in this game, but Engage opts to settle for tired cliches that even newcomers of Fire Emblem should recognize or see coming unless they've literally never watched any anime, any TV, played a JRPG, or read any fiction ever in their life ever. Claiming that I'm just not the target audience this time around because Engage tried to appeal to a younger demographic that clearly isn't me, just to dismiss anyone over their teenage years of criticizing it, is something I very much disagree with, because this series has basically always made appeals to a younger demographic anyway. Let's not pretend that this series was ever rated anything higher than T. FE7 was rated E and was extremely easy for my teenage self to latch onto, and it was until many years later that I realized just how much depth the writers actually packed into it. Literally every game in the series, especially post-Kaga and FE6, has fun, fantastical, colorful designs, and pretty simple concepts for its rated E or T audience to follow along with. But then again, every game has nuances that you may have missed the first time around. In my opinion, Engage carries itself by these safe, by-the-numbers tropes, while also not providing nuance to the level of past Fire Emblem titles that were also marketed towards teens. To Engage's credit, a lot of the cast is elevated by support conversations, so at least that content has had its intended purpose executed solidly well. This makes it challenging for me to even recommend playing Engage as a first Fire Emblem game over others to my peers, some of whom are in their teens in the same local gaming communities as me. These days, I actually recommend them buying Three Houses over Engage, because that way I know they're most likely going to be invested in everything that game has to offer on a first playthrough. Characters, story, gameplay, the big three. Engage's chapter gameplay is without question its greatest strength. It's honestly probably the best gameplay experience in the series, or at least top 3 to me. And Maddening is so balanced to be a good, challenging, and fun time that even if you swapped the recruitment orders of units and emblems, you are going to have an extremely positive experience anyway, which is mind-blowing to me. I just think Fire Emblem as a series is more than the sum of its parts. To me, story and characters matter more in this series than in other IPs. It always has. Yes, at the end of the day, this is a game, and Engage is a wonderful gameplay experience, but I think it's evident from sales and general sentiments of Engage that I've seen and felt that alone in this era of Fire Emblem is not enough.